This is the Lightning Junkies podcast with your host, Chaz Crypterson. On this episode of the podcast, we have Giacomo Zucco, and we're talking about RGB, Spectrum, and Storm. We recorded this episode at the Lightning Network conference in Berlin, inside of the Decentruck that was provided by Paralelni Polis. We really appreciate that, as well as Fulmo that helped to make that a reality. Since we were borrowing their truck at the end of the day, we had a very limited amount of time to record. That's why this episode is so short. As well, the audio isn't the greatest because I had a very janky setup in order to make it work. So you can hear a lot of background noise, and the mic wasn't very close to either me or Giacomo. But I think you're going to like the episode anyway. Before we jump into the episode, I just wanted to do a couple shout outs to some people that I met at the Lightning Network conference. This includes Elizabeth Stark from Lightning Labs, Jameson Lopp from Casa, Anchor from Bolts.exchange, Pete and Pete from BottlePay, Tim from Paywall.link, Will, Tom, and Harsha from Fold, Roy from Breeze Wallet, Rockstar Dev from BTC Pays server, Michael Folkson, that was running both the Socratic Seminar and the Project Showcase, Raw Avocado, that was very snarky and funny in person, Rene Picard for running his Lightning Network workshop, Ken Kruger from Moon, and many other people that I'm forgetting right now. This was probably the most social that I've been in many years, concentrated into several days. Berlin is one of the most beautiful cities that I've ever been in my entire life, and I would definitely recommend going if you ever get the chance. Like I said before, this episode is a lot shorter than normal, and the audio quality isn't that great. With that being said, this is the 7th episode of the Lightning Junkies podcast, coming at your face. We are recording from the Lightning Conference in Berlin. Right now, I have Giacomo Zucco, and we're going to be talking about RGB. Welcome to the podcast, Giacomo.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody.
All right, so I just kind of want to jump into things because we don't have a lot of time, kind of on a time crunch here. So I'm going to kind of skip over the kind of usual stuff where I ask, how did you get into Bitcoin and all that, and kind of get, more into the meat and potatoes and everything here. So could you kind of give me a very basic overview of what RGB kind of is here?
Sure. Basically, RGB is a proposal for yet another asset protocol on top of Bitcoin. So it's on top of Bitcoin and not on top of shitcoins like Ethereum. It's a little bit more like, in this way, counterparty on Omni. So it tries to reuse the good things that we can reuse from the existing standards and tools and best practices without reinventing the wheel. But unlike the typical Bitcoin-based asset protocols like Omni and Counterparty, it has a different architecture because first of all, it's based on the client-side validation idea by Peter Todd. So you don't use the Bitcoin time chain, polluting it with all the metadata for the assets. You just use it for avoiding double spending, and that's all. Every other metadata about the asset, the signature of the transfer, everything, the issuance, everything will be moved off-band. So you have zero time chain footprint on Bitcoin. You just use Bitcoin UTXOs to prove that you don't double spend the asset, and then you pass everything off-band. And the second characteristic of RGB is that it leverages very, very strongly Lightning Network. First of all, because the idea is that if you can move the assets on top of the Lightning Network, that improves privacy and scalability of the asset system, and it may improve privacy and scalability of Lightning Network itself in some way that we may discuss. And the second idea is that the main problem with the client-side validation idea by Peter is that it's cool, it's great, but you need to stay online on the time to receive in order to receive, and you need to back up all the off-chain data by yourself, the updated version. So it's quite complex from the UX point of view. And the nice thing is that all the challenges that you have in order to make a client-side validation protocol work are the same that Lightning Network already have, but double. Like in Lightning Network, you have to store the data of the channel, of course, but not only. You also have to store it privately, because otherwise other party can use it against you. And you have to stay online to receive, but not only, you have to stay online to make sure that, at least sometimes, that to make sure that nobody can try to breach the contract of the channel. So if Lightning Network can work, and a client-side validation protocol can leverage all the stuff that make Lightning Network work in order to work as well. So it's a very I would say it's a very parallel but overlap project.
Okay, got it. So I was watching your kind of talk earlier, and not only did you mention RGB, but you mentioned Spectrum. Is there a difference between RGB and Spectrum, and if so, what is it?
Yeah, Spectrum is an evolution on the original RGB idea, which is explicitly, RGB can leverage the Lightning Network or not. You can send also an on-chain, let's say, transaction with the RGB assets. So even if you don't have a Lightning Network channel, but when you try to move assets on top of Lightning Network channels with the RGB compatibility with Lightning Network, you face a problem. The problem is that in order to route something, you need liquidity of that something. So if I don't have a channel with Bob, but I have a channel with Alice, which has a channel with Bob, I can still route in order to pay with Lightning to Bob. With the assets, that's more complicated, because now I need an asset-enabled channel with Bob, and he needs an asset-enabled channel with Alice. So let's assume that's not the case. But let's assume that Bob has a normal Lightning Network route through Carol that will have a asset colored, let's say, channel through Bob. In that case, I basically can use Spectrum, which is an idea to the idea of Spectrum is you turn the Lightning Network daemon into a little trading bot, and the trading bot of the asset colored channel will receive a payment in asset, condition it to a route of payment in Bitcoin that on the other end will be itself conditioned to another payment to the asset. So I can, if you have a let's say USD Tether channel, and I have a USD Tether channel on Spectrum, I can pay you using Lightning, even if we don't have a liquidity among us. So it's a little bit of a decentralized exchange idea, even if the terminology decentralized exchange is a little bit scammy these days, but that's what it is basically.
Okay, got it. And something else to kind of just touch on it very quickly is Storm that was mentioned. Do you want to briefly mention what that is?
So Storm is another project which some of the people working right now. So before everything, RGB is not a company effort, it's not a product, it's not a startup. It's a proposal originally by me and then met by other people. So it's an open non-profit proposal. And some of the people working on this proposal, namely Maxine that was presenting with me, was also working on other kinds of possible things on top of Lightning Network. Storm in particular is a decentralized storage protocol proposal which leverages Lightning Network payments. So and many people try to do decentralized storage like StoreJ, MadeSafe, Filecoin. The things that they have in common is that unfortunately they created a scam coin, which creates useless economic friction and makes everything socially unscalable as well. So Storm is the idea to take yet again this whole idea of decentralized storage, but instead of doing that with a scam coin, you do that with Lightning Network payments. So you have the Lightning Network layer, and on top of that you have a layer in which you can exchange messages, generic messages, and on top of that you can basically pay people to give you back chunks of your encrypted, of course, files, so you can somehow spread this around. This kind of project has a double possible interaction with RGB. Basically, it, like RGB and like Spectrum in particular, it is a layer 3 protocol, so it will leverage Lightning Network, so it's similar in this way. What we need to do in order to make RGB and Spectrum work will also, hopefully, could also make Storm work. But there is another kind of reverse relation. If we have Storm, like a way to storage data in a decentralized way, then we can maybe leverage Storm for watchtowers and RGB watchtowers as well. So we can leverage that in order to store your off-chain and off-band data that you cannot store on your private seed.
Okay, got it. So, earlier in your kind of introduction about RGB, you mentioned Counterparty and Omni, and I'm sure you remember that like all kinds of tokens and things were created on those, and most of those ended up just being garbage that no one cared about. Do you think something similar is going to happen, kind of on top of these kind of layer 3 technologies that you're talking about?
Definitely. If it doesn't, it would just be only because people is tired or maybe disillusionist of this kind of tokens. So that's the only, but it's not the merit of the protocol. The protocol itself is, I think it's optimal and interesting from a technological point of view, and it may host scammy tokens as well as legit tokens. So it's not that the protocol makes the economic union legit. For example, by myself, I'm very skeptical about token use cases in general. The reason I'm excited about RGB is mostly because it's an experiment to test this new client-side validator architecture. So for me, it's mostly R&D. The only exception I will make to this general rule is that I'm quite positive to the role of stuff like Tether on Bitcoin, because I'm very concerned by KYC kind of limitation. I mean, if we assume hyper-Bitcoinization, we have to assume that wealth will have to move from US dollar mostly, or from other fiat shitcoins, to Bitcoin. In order to do that, you need exchange. In order to exchange, you have this kind of friction with KYC. You have things like BSQ, which are great, but they are very non-atomic. You have the Bitcoin pair, which works fine, but then the dollar or euro fiat pair works not so fine. It can work. I mean, I encourage everybody to try to use BSQ, but it's still not perfect to serve a very huge liquidity. With something like Tether, I think that there is an interesting opportunity to detach the trading part from the let's say USD voucher part, which is still very it will still be under very strong regulatory pressure. So it's not that the regulators will not try to stop Tether. They are trying, they will try, but this separation of roles between the trading that can be decentralized, for example, top of Spectrum. So what I imagine is companies like Tether issuing this representative of US dollar, and then protocols like Spectrum where you can actually seamlessly and very easily exchange that for Bitcoin. And eventually that can be very interesting. Another use case that is completely legit, even if not economically revolutionary, is digital collectibles. So when you issue a token, the typical reaction by Bitcoin maximalism and myself is, why do you ever use a decentralized protocol if you are issuing the token in a centralized way anyway? So if you are Starbucks issuing tokens for coffee, just use your Starbucks app, which is centralized and so probably more efficient. But in case of collectibles, the collectibles are particular goods that can survive and be traded when the original creator of the collectible is also disappeared, maybe since many years. You can have like old post stamps and stuff like that. So in the digital collectible, maybe use a protocol like RGB, because you can imagine an issuer creating these digital artworks or something like rare papers or something like that, and then the creator disappearing anyway, that and not having any kind of centralized service. You can still have people trading that. Of course, I don't expect that to be unlike the people theorizing the token economy. I don't think any of these would be as relevant as Bitcoin itself, of course, but they are legit use cases.
Got it. So yeah, I definitely heard about Bitfinex, doing Tether, Voltaro doing their V-Gold thing.
Yeah.
So do you think, you already kind of touched on Tether, do you think, those sorts of things will generally have the most kind of use case and kind of go the further, or do you think it will be more of the collectibles like you mentioned?
I think that the most, if everything works fine, and we can get USD Tether and V-Gold and other kind of fiat proxies on top of RGB in a working way, I think that they will have the most evident effect in the short medium term. So collectible will be kind of irrelevant at the beginning, and this kind of liquidity bridge between fiat and Bitcoin will have a huge relevance. But in the long term, I think if you think 20 years, I think the other way around would be the situation. So maybe some when people will use Bitcoin for everything, maybe some collectibles on top of RGB will still be traded or used, because why not? A niche part of the economy, but still a part of the economy. While this bridge solution between fiat and Bitcoin, we don't need those after hyper-Bitcoinization. We need those before to facilitate this transfer of wealth, limiting the more that we can KYC kind of a disruption.
Okay, so I kind of want to move on to some possible issues or downsides with these kind of layer 3 kind of technologies here. So the other night I was at the kind of coding meetup for the Lightning conference, and I was kind of bringing up, layer 3 to other people to kind of see what they thought. And what someone brought up I thought was very interesting was the idea of if a particular asset or, something on top of these layer 3 technologies were to become more valuable than Bitcoin, that it could create a perverse incentive. And someone even referenced a article by Nick Carter calling it top heaviness. Do you have any particular opinion about, possible, miners, choosing to attack? I don't know the technical part of it, but do you know any kind of argument there?
Yes, it's a good argument. I think it's a right argument. The fact that asset protocols on top of Bitcoin may be incentive incompatible, it's actually a good argument. I think that RGB, this was one of the first concerns that we were always trying to mitigate. I don't think RGB solves that entirely. I think it mitigates that seriously. First of all, in RGB, miners don't even know that some transaction is an RGB transaction. So censorship, because of this kind of extra Bitcoin economic incentives, is kind of hard. That said, you can have, for example, somebody telling miners that there is value there because for some reason. So you have Binance that gets hacked by $3 billion Tether dollars, and now they want to reverse the chain. When we talk about Bitcoin, there is an economic parallel between the kind of value that has been, for example, lost in a hack, and so the kind of value you want to get back, and the kind of opportunity cost in order to reverse the chain. While that may not be true in RGB, so I think it mitigates partially the situation, but doesn't solve it completely. The other thing is that Spectrum transactions will be even more private, because not only you will not see the off-band part of the metadata, but you will not even see any transaction at all. Miners cannot reverse Lightning transactions. They can try to reverse Lightning settlement, for example, or closure. So I don't think that this concern should be dismissed. I think that anyway, what we are doing is basically permissionless. So if it can be built, it will be built if it's possible. So we try to build it in a more responsible way possible in order to minimize this kind of concern. But we should not dismiss these concerns at all.
Okay, got it. Do you see any other kind of big reasons to be skeptical of RGB, Spectrum, etc.?
Yeah, the presentation today, the part of the presentation that Maxime was carrying out was mostly about the fact that saying layer 3 is a thing and doing layer 3 is another thing. Because layer 1 is, at this point, it will go over some transformation yet, like Schnorr, I hope, but it's kind of stable at this point, and it's getting more and more stable. While layer 2 itself is not a very steady foundation for layer 3 yet, because when we try to assume some Lightning Network architecture in order to do Spectrum and stuff like that, it basically changed under our feet continuously over the months, one month to the other, and it's going to get even more fast, and it's fast and reckless. So building this kind of stuff, I think it makes sense. This kind of stuff doesn't make sense directly on Bitcoin for many reasons. It does make way more sense on top of layer 2, but that said, it will start to really become usable when layer 2 itself will become more stabilized, and it's still very, very early on. Also, the way the Lightning Network has been, as Maxime explained, the way the Lightning Network has been built with the bold specification effort, which is something great. I mean, the fact that many implementations started to try to be compatible with the standard was great, but the specification were not really built in a very ordered way. There as many spontaneous order phenomenon. The spontaneous order is very anti-fragile, but it's not very efficient and not very clean in its geometry. So if you look at the Lightning Network layers right now, and of layers of layer 3 solutions on top of that, and you try to put the bold specification matching with them, you will see that some are horizontal, some are vertical, some are diagonal, some are completely missing. Some parts are not even really specified or are under-specified. So it will be hard. I think that a minimal viable product can be done in reasonable times, but it may be not very routable, not very interoperable. So doing what I described in a really standard, global, scalable way may prove very, very slow and very, very difficult. Doing something usable, I mean, having again USD Tether on top of Spectrum in a reasonable amount of months across nodes which are compatible with that kind of implementation, it's probably feasible. Having a full Spectrum versus Bitcoin market with interoperability across different Lightning nodes, that may be challenging. Having a situation like Storm or distributed computation paid in Lightning, that will probably take even more time.
So how long do you think all this might end up taking if everything kind of goes well?
2 weeks, of course.
Oh, of course. Okay, got it. Okay, so I kind of want to go kind of more broad and kind of take a small step back from layer 3 here. Do you think that there are any particular reasons to be skeptical of the Lightning Network, kind of more generally?
Not really skeptical, but maybe manage expectations for sure. For example, while the idea of a channel is a very sound idea technologically at this point, the idea of routing is a hack, and is still a hack. HTLC routing is a hack. If you switch from hashes to elliptic curve points, it may be made better for several reasons, but still routing is not super easy to have, and also we can have some situation of divergence of protocol that creates some incompatibility. As I said before, Lightning Network specification is under-specified, and right now there are some things that have been, I mean, Eclair is accepting double paid invoices, which Lightning Network is accepted, but LND is accepted but not doing, and C Lightning is refusing. So there is some kind of complexity there. So I think that there are reasons to be to manage expectations. We have seen today during the conference a lot of debunking of easy myths about Lightning Network privacy. Lightning Network is better for privacy in a general sense that putting everything in global consensus forever is very bad for privacy. But it's not the magic. It's not a magic dust that you can just put on top of your node and it becomes private. It's still super messy because now you have network level concerns. You still have man in the middle and intermediary attacks. So it's a work in progress. What is good is that you can screw up the Lightning Network. It's not a problem. If we screw up the Lightning Network, we just build another Lightning Network. I don't think that's the case. I think that the Lightning Network which exists now will be smoothly made interoperable with L2 and other stuff. But even if it's the case that we screw up badly in Lightning Network, we can burn it down and build it again. Not the same with Bitcoin, where you have to re-bootstrap an entire economy with something like monetary aspects that are so hard to build and so hard to switch to migrate to something else.
Got it. So let's kind of go on the other side. Is there anything that makes you excited about the Lightning Network?
Well, sure. Everything that already works. I mean, finally, I don't think that Bitcoin is important right now for small payments, because small payments, being small, fast and repetitive payments, being small, fast and repetitive, can tolerate a lot of counterparty risk. So if you want censorship resistance on a small, repeated and fast payment, you probably can route around censorship somehow. Bitcoin was especially needed as a foundation for a monetary system which was censorship resistant. So it was more an alternative to e-gold and an alternative, a way to pay for WikiLeaks. It was something more important than small payments. But even knowing this, a lot of people were anyway, I mean, small repeated fast payments are a way to demonstrate the technology, are a nice way from a social point of view to experiment and play with the protocol. So back then when you could pretend to send Bitcoin very fast to your friend at zero cost, it was not true, because like zero confirmation was never safe, and small costs were just paid, were just apparent small costs because the high costs were paid by the holder with inflation. So nothing is free, but the illusion to be able to be random, casual, small, fast payments was very instrumental to the cultural diffusion of the protocol. So it's great to have that back. For example, I try not to pay with Bitcoin if I can pay with fiat, of course. But when I do want to pay with Bitcoin, for example, for social reasons, because I am at the Lightning conference, or for example, for legal reasons, because Paralelni Polis doesn't accept fiat, because the entire structure is created in a way that is not fiat dependent. So I had to use Bitcoin, and or because I want to pay for my VPN and I really don't like the VPN to know my name on the credit card. In all these cases, I'm grateful that I finally can have a better user experience for small payments and fast payments as well. So the Lightning Network was created mostly for this, and it kind of worked for this. Of course it can work, then we charged this with a lot of further expectations about layer 3 and super privacy, yeah, of course. But the things that Lightning Network already does is already enough. And also, as I told in my speech at the Fulmo Hack Days in Munich, what is very exciting about the Lightning Network is that since you can mess it up, because we are layer 2 and we can mess up, you bring back some of that experimental spirit that in Bitcoin you couldn't responsibly use anymore, because in Bitcoin you have to be safe, critically, adversarial thinking, safety critical, conservative. In Lightning you can be reckless because it's a layer 2, small amounts, and so you can mess up.
Got it. Okay, so let's just kind of talk about the Lightning Network conference here. We're kind of running out of time. Were there any talks that you really liked, that you really kind of learned a lot about?
There is the talk by Rusty Russell about a kind of new possibilities for invoice requestments and stuff like that. Really made me think about new possibilities using this protocol. The talk by Christian Decker about analytics was very, very interesting. The talks today about privacy, there were a couple of talks about privacy that were very interesting and also very realistic, and also maybe debunking some naive expectations. And then there, a lot of stuff really, but not just the talks, also the workshops, the BTC Pay workshop, all the things that builders are building on the second floor. So machine for Lightning Network payments of drinks or whatever, actually.
Absolutely. So we're going to be kind of wrapping up here probably, but what do you see as being the kind of optimistic view of kind of Bitcoin and the Lightning Network generally? Where do you see us going?
So I think that the Lightning Network, this conference was very important, because the Lightning Network, being layer 2 and being in a way less conditioned by global consensus, was also going through a route in which different implementations were kind of starting not really talking together very nicely. So having this kind of I forgot to mention before the presentation by Electrum of the new Electrum implementation. So we have another one in Python, and also there was Eclair Async presenting the new Eclair alternative Phoenix. So we talk a lot about C Lightning and about LND, but now we have C Lightning, LND, and all the work by Matt Corral and others about the Rust Lightning libraries, and now we have Electrum, and now we have also possibly something else. So all these implementations with this kind of conference, they may start to make some more effort in order to stay more standard. And so my expectation for the future is that this goes on, and possibly we can screw up, but possibly we don't. And this Lightning Network we have now can become the foundations for even more complex and flexible use cases. Let's say there was a phase in Bitcoin in which everybody was dreaming about everything crazy, like the decentralized organization. Then there was and I was in that phase as well. I was a shitcoiner in 2013. Then you get to the phase of realism, in which you learn what can work and what cannot, and you clean up from also because many scammers will leverage dreams in order to sell snake oil. So you have to clean out the situation from all this noise. But now, if the Lightning Network evolves as it seems it may, you can get back some of that more imaginific, more visionary expectation of new cool stuff to build.
Okay, so and the last question I have for you is, you began your talk today by saying you're no longer a toxic maximalist. Is this true?
Yeah, it was mostly a joke about my Tokyo Riga. I don't know how long I will pull it off. Basically, since my talk about Bitcoin maximalism in Balticon Badger 2018 created a lot of drama and outrage, this year, as a joke, I did a pro shitcoin talk. I also took off my Bitcoin maximalism shirt, and there was a rainbow unicorn shirt underneath. So I changed my profile pic and header, and I don't know how long it will go, but now it's funny. What I noticed that scammers get triggered even more if I pretend to be a pro shitcoin guy now. So it's funny in a way, but probably I will get back to toxicity soon.
All right, sounds good. Well, we're kind of out of time here, so I really appreciate you joining me on the Lightning Junkies podcast, Giacomo.
Same. Thank you for having me here.
Boom. That was the 7th episode of the Lightning Junkies podcast. I definitely learned a lot from Giacomo, and I hope you did too. If you did take something away from this episode, I would highly recommend that you subscribe and or donate to the crowdfunding campaign at crowdfund.lightningjunkies.net, btl.2/@LNJunkies, and tipping.me/@LNJunkies. In the first few episodes of the podcast, I put out the stand that I was not going to accept sponsorship. But with some feedback from my audience, I have started to reconsider this position. If a sponsor wants to reach out and sponsor this podcast and make it so I can keep making it going forward, you can reach out to me at chaz@lightningjunkies.net. For now, I'm going to go ahead and end the episode, but I'll see you on the Lightning Network.